Okay, so like a typical parent, my 20% project came from things I noticed with my own kids. I've got 4 kids, and even though I'm not the type of parent that thinks they need to fill every second of every day of my kids' lives, I just don't have time for that, and I don't think it's good for them. I did want to be the kind of parent that supports and encourages their interests. With my first 3 kids, it was pretty easy because their interests lay in the more creative side. The first one loves books. She can't get enough of them. I actually even have to hide them from her until she gets her homework done because she obviously doesn't share that same love for textbooks. She's selective. My next kid, she liked to draw comic books. In elementary and middle school, she actually had a comic book series that she would draw and sell to kids at school called The Adventures of Nacho Man. And he eventually fell by the wayside after she got her first guitar, and everything has been about music ever since. And she's been pretty successful with it. She's even playing the House of Blues this week. My third kid, Jackson, he's a writer. That's what he wants to do. He writes stories all the time. In his free time, he's writing stories or playing video games because he's a typical kid. More specifically, he wants to be a best-selling author, and I encourage this because Mommy wants a house on the beach. I found all of these pretty easy to nurture and support. There's a lot of things out there. If you look hard enough, you can even find that a lot of them are affordable, if not free, to meet these kind of creative needs. And schools today are pretty accommodating for readers and writers and even musicians, and there's so many after-school programs really directed at this kind of creative expression. But when I had my 4th kid, Billy, all that changed. You see, Billy is brilliant. I'm not just saying that because I'm his mom and I'm supposed to, but also because it's true. If state testing has any value, he's gotten perfect scores on most of them, and he's just constantly inquiring. And my biggest concern for him when he started school is that it would break all of the things that I found so perfect about him and try to make him fit in a box. You see, this kid loves to learn things. He's been a computer kid since he was 2, and he'd find something that interested him and find out everything he could about it. First there were dinosaurs, and then rocks and go-karts and how a telephone works and flashlights. And after he'd look up as much as he thought he needed to, he'd go into the garage and he'd build things, or he'd destroy things, or he'd go to the park and look for rocks or whatever else was actually interesting him at the time. I think schools stifle this kind of learning, at least real learning, the kind that lets you have an idea and see it through and play with it for a while. And I started to notice that school hasn't changed much in the last century. With all the advancements we have in technology and schools of education, a classroom today still looks a lot like a classroom 100 years ago. Students may be more casually dressed, and now they have air conditioning, but for the most part, we run the same model. And I started noticing that my son, even though he got good grades and was doing pretty well in school, he seemed to be learning more on the weekends and summer vacation than he'd learn all year in school. And it seemed that that was because he got to try things. I mean, I tried to make sure he wasn't going to set the house on fire or any of his siblings, but for the most part, he was given free range to try things out with what we had. And he seemed to learn more when he messed up than when he got it right. And he got to discover things that he loved doing. And for him, that was computer coding, which he picked up at 8, and dealing with anything electrical. And now that I'm sure that you're bored with my son, I'll tell you that seeing all this with him led me to venting to a friend one night. My friend Ellie at dinner, she, after 20 years as an ICU nurse, became a high school science teacher. And in 2012, she was San Diego's Teacher of the Year. And I told her how I thought it seemed like we could be doing so much more to make education relevant and give them something hands-on to do and figure out. And she told me about the work that she was doing with Project Lead the Way. Project Lead the Way is an organization that developed from the same type of issues that I had with the types of curriculum being used in the classroom. They started creating a new curriculum for STEM subjects, the science, technology, engineering, and math. And they set their sights on an activity and problem-based type curriculum that have been becoming adopted by a lot of schools nationwide. They have 3 separate curriculums, one for elementary school called Launch, and all of their curriculums are designed to fit within the Common Core state standards that are developed so that teachers can easily implement them into their units and allow for flexibility. Now, an example of a 3rd grade Project Lead the Way module would be that students will learn about things like Newton's law of motion, and then they'll add some computer-aided design, and students will design gliders. They'll design them on the computer with what they've learned, and then they'll do test examples on the computer, and they will build a model glider, and then they modify their gliders depending on success or failure to solve some type of a real world problem. In middle school, they have the Gateway curriculum, which are these 9-week modules, and they solve real world problems. That's the biggest thing about Project Lead the Way, is they like to implement real world problems so that the kids learning this have something relevant to attach it to. And they do things like, they have a module on medical detectives where they're given a real world medical problem and they have to diagnose it, or they're asked to design, test, and build an airfoil for aeronautical learning. They also start introducing the computer sciences at the middle school level, and students will do things like create their own apps. One of my favorite things they do at the middle school level is bridge building. Now, my kids aren't in a Project Lead the Way school, but my son is in an engineering club that uses Project Lead the Way curriculum in it, and it cost me a small fortune. And the bridge building one is great because the kids have to design their own bridges, and they have to, at the end, the final test is to see if they bear weight. And these kids fail and they try again, and they fail and they try again, and at the end they see what kind of bridges bear weight, and they learn the math of it and the physics of it, and they have fun. The high school curriculum changes. It gets broken into 3 fields. They separate it. They have engineering, biomedical sciences, and computer science. And my friend Ellie that I talked about is now the director of school engagement for Project Lead the Way, and is part of the team that creates the curriculum for the high school biomedical sciences. And when she was teaching this in the classroom, at the end of one of her units, where students were given a problem, for example, one of the problems is to design an effective emergency room, she would implement a triage day where students would put their designs to the test, and they would spend the day in the field. Everyone was given a different injury, and they would put different ER designs to the test to see how they worked most effectively. One of the best things I've seen with Project Lead the Way is that it doesn't just focus on doing it right or making a project work, but figuring out why it didn't. They learn from the failures, and more often than not, they wind up laughing about them. The main thing that I want to get is that Project Lead the Way is getting results. They're finding that students using a Project Lead the Way curriculum are consistently scoring higher on state exams. And something that I found interesting, they also have higher rates of attendance across the nation. Kids don't want to miss school. And I don't know if this is something that needs to be implemented into every school, but I do hope that their success rates with the kids get schools looking into a more relevant and hands-on type of curriculum. I know it's the kind of teaching that I'd like to be doing.